Verena Hartman was on her knees in the cold mud of the cookhouse step, scrubbing a banker's boot print off her clean-swept floor when the man who left it told her she had until sundown to clear off the land like the rest of the worthless stock. She did not look up. She kept scrubbing, her big round forearms red to the elbow, her flour-dusted bun coming loose at the back, her wide, soft shoulders rounded over the brush, and she let him believe she was exactly what he took her to be, a fat hired cook with no name worth knowing and no business worth saving. Her worth that morning would not be measured by the 280 pounds the men joked about behind her back, nor by the grease on her purple work dress, but by the single folded paper she had carried sewn into the lining of her trunk for 9 long months, and by the fact that every acre that Banker had come to seize already, quietly, belonged to her. He did not know that yet. Mr. Pruitt stood over her in the doorway in his town coat and his tall hat, a seizure notice rolled in his gloved fist, looking down at the broad back of the heaviest woman on the place, and he saw a problem to be swept out with the morning. He could not have guessed that the woman scrubbing his boot print was the only person within 40 miles who could ruin him. If you find yourself pulling for Verena before the morning is out, do me one small kindness. Leave the name of your town down in the comments, just your town, so I can see how far this story travels and who it finds. That is all I will ask of you. The rest of this is hers to tell, and I would not interrupt it for the world. Stay to the end. You will want to be there when the paper comes out of the lining. Now, let me take you back to how a Dutch girl with no money and no people came to be on her knees on the Callaway Ranch with a deed to it sewn against her heart, and how nobody, not one living soul, knew she held it. It had started that spring on a dot-end ranch in the high, dry country where the Callaway brand had run cattle for 30 years and was now running out of time. Wade Callaway buried his wife in the second week of March, and his oldest dream the same week, because the bank held paper on the place, and the bank did not grieve. He was a big-shouldered man in a brown wide-brim hat, 38 years old, a vest gone shiny at the seams, and a cream work shirt he had stopped bothering to mend, a revolver on his hip he had not fired in anger in years, and hands so weathered and scarred from rope and wire that they looked older than the rest of him. He looked like a dangerous man. He was, in truth, the safest man for 60 miles, and the loneliest. And on the day Verena Hartman came up his road on a borrowed mule, he was too tired and too broke to be either kind or cruel. He was just done. The ranch needed a cook. The last one had quit when the wages stopped. Wade had put the word out in the town of Ash Fork the way a drowning man puts out a hand, not because he believed it would do any good, but because a man has to do something. Feed the hands or lose them, and he was down to 4 hands and 600 head and a mortgage that came due at first frost. So when the freighter dropped a heavy-set young woman at the head of his road with a battered trunk and a letter of character from a hotel in Kansas City, Wade did not see a future wife, and he did not see his salvation. He saw one more mouth, a big one, and he almost sent her back down the road on the spot. She came up the last quarter mile on foot, leading the freighter's mule because she would not make a tired animal carry her and her trunk both, and that was the first thing about Verena Hartman that the men of the Callaway Ranch noticed and laughed at. A woman that size, walking to spare a mule. Dale Sturgis, the foreman, leaned on the corral rail and watched her come and said something low to the hand beside him, and the hand laughed and the laugh carried clean across the yard, because an unkind sound always carries farthest. Verena heard it. She had heard that exact laugh in 3 states and on 4 ranches and at the back doors of more kitchens than she could count, and she had long ago decided what she would do about it, which was nothing. She walked into the yard, set down the trunk, took off her bonnet, and looked at the rangy, gray-eyed man who could only be the owner. "You sent to Ash Fork for a cook," she said. Her voice was low and even, and carried the soft, round edges of the old country, the V's gone almost to W's, her mother's voice come out of her own mouth. "I am the cook?" Wade looked at her for a long moment. He took in the size of her, as every man did, and she watched him take it in and waited for the thing men's faces did next. But his face did not do it. He was too far gone in his own troubles to spare the energy for contempt. He just looked tired. "I can't pay much," Wade said. "Truth, I can't pay near anything till the cattle sell in the fall, and they may not sell enough." "You can pay me in a roof and a stove and what the garden makes," Verena said. "I will take the wages when the cattle pay, if they pay." "And if they don't?" "Then I will have cooked for a man who needed it," she said, "and that is not the worst way I have spent a season." Wade studied her. "Most cooks want the wage up front." "Most cooks have somewhere else to be," Verena said. "I do not. And a man who tells the truth about his empty pockets before he's asked is a man worth feeding on credit. You could have lied to me about the wages and worked it out of me till the frost. You did not. That tells me more than a full purse would." Del Sturgis snorted from the rail. "Boss, we can't feed her and the crew both on what's left. Look at the size of—" "That'll do, Del," Wade said, not loud. He was looking at the trunk, at the careful patches on the woman's purple dress, at how she had walked his road on foot to spare a borrowed mule, and some old buried instinct in him that the grief had not quite killed told him to keep her. "Cookhouse is round back. Stove draws poor. Wood's where you find it." "I will find it," said Verena Hartman, and she picked up her trunk, the whole weight of it, alone, and carried it round the back of the house. And that was how she came on to the land that, though not one soul on it knew, the law already said was hers. The trunk was heavy because of what was in the lining. Sewn flat against the cedar bottom, under the spare apron, and the good winter shawl, and the 3 books she owned, folded in a square of oiled cloth to keep the damp off, was a deed, not a copy. The deed, the original, the one filed and witnessed and signed, the one paper in all the world that said who truly owned the Callaway Ranch and every acre of grass and water and timber that came with it, and the name on that deed, written in a dead man's careful hand, was not Wade Callaway's. But I am ahead of myself. You will have that paper, all of it, before we are through, every line of how it came to be hers and why she had not spoken of it, and what it cost her to keep silent while men laughed at her in the yard. For now, hold only this. Verena knew what she carried. She had read it 100 times by candle, and she had decided, for reasons that were good and hard and entirely hers, to say nothing, to come on to this place as a hired cook, to do the work, to watch the man, and to learn whether the land was in the hands of someone who deserved it before she ever breathed a word about whose hands it was supposed to be in. She lit the cold stove. It drew poor, as Wade had warned. The chimney was choked with 3 years of soot, and a fallen brick had narrowed the flue. and most women would have left it for a man to mend. Verena did not leave things for men to mend. She found a length of stovepipe wire, bent a hook on the end, lay down flat on the cookhouse floor in her good traveling dress, and reached her whole arm up the cold black throat of the chimney to the elbow, and worked the fallen brick loose and the soot down in a gritty rain that powdered her face and her bun and the front of her dress. And she came up filthy and coughing, and the stove, when she lit it again, drew hard and clean and hungry. She had been on the Callaway Ranch under an hour. She had not unpacked, and she was already on her back inside its chimney, with her arm to the shoulder in its soot, fixing a thing 4 men had stepped around for 3 years. She found the wood where you find it, which on a broke ranch means the hard places, a half-rotted rail nobody would miss. Deadfall from the creek line, she dragged up the bank 2 pieces at a time. She found the larder near bare, a side of salt pork gone past its best, a bin of flour, a little coffee, beans, lard, and not much else. The stores of a man feeding men on the edge of nothing. A lesser cook would have made a thin, sad supper of it, and let the meanness of the larder excuse her. Verena looked at the bare shelves and decided, as she always decided, to win anyway with what was on the table. She trimmed the bad off the salt pork and set the rest to render slow. She walked the creek in the last of the light and came back with wild onion and a fistful of watercress and a double handful of late choke cherries she would boil down to a sauce. She mixed and kneaded and set bread to rise in the warm by the now roaring stove, her big, strong arms working the dough in a rhythm older than the country she stood in, and she got a pot of beans going low and slow with the rendered pork and the wild onion folded through. By the time the 4 hands came in off the range at dusk, gray with dust and short with hunger and ready to be unkind to the fat new cook, there was bread in the oven, gone gold at the crust, and a pot of beans, gone rich with the rendered pork and the wild onion, and the cookhouse smelled of something none of them had smelled in a long time. It smelled of a place a person might want to come home to. They came in mean, and they sat down meaner. There were 4 of them. Del Sturgis, the foreman, 2 middling hands named Crail and Boyd, who took their cues from Del and poured themselves into whatever shape he set, and the boy, Toby Pratt. Del Sturgis took the head of the table as though he owned it, and looked at the plate she set down and the spread she'd made out of near nothing, and instead of being grateful, he was suspicious. A certain kind of man is always suspicious of a good thing he didn't arrange himself. "Bit much, ain't it?" Del said, "for a woman feedin' off a broke man's larder." "Eat or don't," Verena said, setting down the bread. "There is more either way." More. Del laughed, and Crail and Boyd laughed with him on cue. "There's the trouble with hiring a big eater to mind the stores, like setting a fox to count the hens." He tore the bread. "How much you reckon she puts away a sitting, boys? 2 men's worth? 3? "You will know how much I put away," Verena said evenly, not turning from the stove. "By what is left when I am done, which on this larder will be your share and theirs untouched, because I have been eating last and least at tables meaner than yours since before you could grow that mustache. Eat your supper, Mr. Sturgis. It will be the best you have had on this place, and you know it. And that is what is really stuck in your throat." Boyd snorted before he could stop himself, and Del shot him a look, and the table went quiet, and they ate. They could not help but eat. The bread was good, and the beans were better, and there was a tart, bright choke cherry sauce that cut the fat of the pork, And these were men who had been fed thin and careless for months, and one by one, sullen and unwilling, they cleaned their plates. A young hand named Toby Pratt, 19 and shy, and the only one of them with manners, set down his spoon and said quietly into the silence, "Best beans I've had since my mother's, miss. I mean it." "Shut your mouth and eat," Dell told him. "He can do both," Verena said, not turning from the stove. "Most people can." And Boyd choked on a laugh he tried to swallow, and Dell glared a hole in his own plate. But the boy had said it, and he'd meant it, and he ate slow on purpose after that to stretch it, the careful slowness a person saves for the good things that come rare. Verena saw that, and when she cleared, she set the heel of the bread, the best piece, the gold-crusted end, by Toby's plate without a word, and the boy looked up at her like she'd done something enormous. And in a way she had, because nobody had given Toby Pratt the best piece of anything in a long time either, and it takes one to know one. Wade ate in the house, alone, as he had every night since his wife died. But the smell came across the yard to him through the open window, bread and onion and salt pork, his wife's smell, his mother's smell, the smell of a working ranch that was not dying. And Wade Calloway sat over his cold, dry plate of the night before his leavings and could not make himself eat it. He went across the yard in the dark and stood outside the cook-house, where the lamplight was warm in the window and the heavy-set new cook was wiping down a table she had scrubbed white, humming low to herself in a language he didn't know, and he stood there a while in the dark and did not go in. He just listened, and then he went back to the house and lay down, and for the first night since March he slept. That was the first day. The deed lay in the lining of the trunk, and the man who would have wept to know it slept 50 yards from it, and the foreman who would have killed to know it sat in the bunkhouse complaining about the size of the cook who held it. Now I will tell you how the paper came to be hers, because you have waited politely and you have earned a piece of it, though not yet all. 3 years before she ever heard the name Calloway, Verena Hartman had been a girl of 19, off the boat 2 years, alone in a country that talked too fast, taking what work a big, plain immigrant girl could get, which was kitchens. She had cooked in a Kansas City hotel for a German family who paid her in coins and contempt, and she had cooked, now and then, for a private dining room upstairs where cattlemen took their suppers when they came to sell. And one of those cattlemen was an old man named August Brandt. August Brandt had built the Calloway Ranch. He had built it from nothing in the year after the war, run the first Calloway cattle on it. For the brand was older than the man who carried it now, and that is a thread you must hold. And he had grown old and rich and bitter on it. And then, in a quarrel I will tell you about later, he had walked away from it and let a younger man named Wade Calloway work it on a handshake and a promise. But Brandt never signed the land over. He kept the deed. An old man's spite, an old man's leverage, an old man's grip on the one beautiful thing he had made and then ruined. He carried that oilskin square of paper buttoned in his coat and fed on it the same as a grudge. He took his suppers alone. Verena remembered the first one, a wet November night, the dining room above the street near empty, and the head waiter came back to the kitchen sour and said the old cattleman in the corner was sending his plate back untouched and being foul about it. And would somebody deal with him before he turned the room? None of the others would go. The old man had a stinging tongue, and the waiters had all felt it. So Verena went, a fat young cook in a stained apron, out into the lamp-lit room where a rich old man with a face like a cracked saddle sat over a plate of cold roast he'd pushed away. "It is too tough for you," she said. Not a question. She had seen how his hands lay folded and useless in his lap, the knuckles swollen, the fingers gone stiff as wood. "It's an insult is what it is," Brant snapped. 40 cents for shoe leather." "The roast is fine," Verena said. "Your hands are not. You cannot cut it, and you would rather send it back and be thought particular than cut it small at the kitchen door and be thought old. I have a grandfather's pride, too, somewhere under all this." She picked up his plate. "Sit. I will bring you something your hands need not fight." He stared at her, this enormous, plain young woman who had read him to the bone in 10 seconds and not flinched at the reading. "And what would you know about it?" he said, but the sting had gone out of him. "I know," Verena said, "that a man who eats alone every night and quarrels with the food is not quarreling with the food. You're an impertinent girl." "I am a tired girl, Mr. Brant," he said, before he had decided to. "Mr. Brant, and you are a hungry man too proud to be fed. We are both of us a great deal of trouble. Sit." And she went and made him a soft thing, eggs barely set, bread soaked in warm milk, and a little sugar, the kind of supper a person makes for the very young and the very old and the very sick, that asks nothing of a failing body. And she brought it out and set it before him and sat down across from him uninvited while he ate it, because the other thing he could not cut, she had seen, was the evening itself. He ate every bite, and the next night he came back and asked for her by no name, because he had none, only the big girl who cooked the eggs, and that was the beginning of it. He took his suppers alone in that Kansas City dining room from then on, but alone with her near, and the only person in that whole loud city who was ever plain kind to him, who brought him the soft food his stomach could take, and sat with him when his hands shook too bad to cut his own meat, was a fat young cook named Verena, who reminded him, he said once, of a sister 50 years dead. "I will not rush the rest of it. You will have it whole, the night he signed, and why and what he made her swear, before the banker ever gets his answer. Keep it where you keep the trunk." The spring turned to summer on the Callaway Ranch, and the cook stayed, and the ranch did not die, though everyone agreed it was only a slower death. Verena rose before the men and slept after them. She found the garden the dead woman had planted and never finished, a square of broken ground behind the house gone to weed, with the ghost of the careful rose still in it, and a child's hand stake here and there where the dead Mrs. Callaway had marked what she meant to grow and never lived to see come up. Verena stood in that abandoned garden the second morning with her hands on her wide hips, and read the whole of Wade Callaway's grief straight off the ground, because what a man cannot bear to finish tells you everything he is. And she finished it. She did not ask. She pulled the weed and turned the soil with a spade, breaking the hard pan a foot at a time, and she planted what the dead woman had staked for and more, beans and squash and onions and a long row of potatoes, and a hill of pumpkins for the fall, and herbs along the edge in her mother's old careful order. She hauled creek water to it in the heat, in 2 great buckets, one in each broad red hand, 200 yards from the creek to the rows and back, again and again, walking the rows with the sweat dark on the back of her purple dress, and her face gone red and her breath short, because a woman of her size hauling water in July pays for every step, and she paid it without a word. The men watched her haul water a fat woman had no business hauling, and they laughed. Crail said something about a draft horse, and Boyd laughed, and even some of the kinder ones smiled. Verena heard it and kept hauling. She had not come to the Callaway Ranch to be liked. She had come to learn a man, and you cannot learn a man from a chair. And then 3 weeks on, the table started showing squash and fresh young onions and the first new potatoes boiled in their skins with a little of the precious butter, and a man who has eaten beans and salt pork for half a year does not laugh at the woman who sets down fresh potatoes, no matter her size. They ate, and they laughed a little less, and Boyd, who had made the draft horse joke, was the one who said it, gruff and not looking up from his plate. "Potatoes are good, missus." He caught himself. "Miss." And he went red to the ears and shut his mouth and ate. It was not much, but it was the first crack. She learned to cattle without anyone teaching her, because no one would teach the cook. By watching from the cookhouse door and asking shy Toby Pratt small questions, he was glad to answer over his plate. "How many head do we run, Toby?" 600, miss. Was 800 2 years back." "And 600 sold in the fall. Does that clear what the banks owed?" The boy looked troubled. "Don't reckon it does. Not the way they'll grade. Calves come small, see? No good bull on the place, just the old scrub, and small calves fetch a small price." He lowered his voice. "And we're short some head besides. Books say 600, but I've counted, and we're light. I don't say where they go. It ain't my place." She marked that. Calves comin' small, and cattle going missing that a frightened boy wouldn't name, and she fed it into everything else she was quietly assembling. She learned that Del Sturgis rode out alone too often and came back with money he had no honest way to have. She learned the shape of the trouble on the Callaway Ranch by the only method she had ever owned, being underestimated in a corner of the room until people forgot she was there and said true things in front of her, and she learned Wade Callaway. She learned that he worked himself past any sense, that he had not laughed since March, that he ate alone out of a grief so total it had become a habit he no longer questioned. She learned that he was fair to his men past the point of his own good, that he had kept Toby Pratt on when he could not afford him because the boy had nowhere else, that he stood between his hands and the worst of the world without ever saying he did it. She learned that the dangerous-looking man was the gentlest soul on the place, and she learned it as she learned every true thing, by watching, and the watching did something to her she had not planned on and did not entirely welcome. The breaking of him, the first crack in the wall between the owner and the cook, came on a black night in July when a heifer went down trying to calve in the far pasture, and the calf was turned wrong. Toby came pounding to the cookhouse near midnight because he didn't dare wake Del, and Wade was 4 miles out checking the south fence, and the heifer was screaming, and the boy was 19 and terrified, and he came to the one person on the ranch he wasn't afraid of. "Miss, the brindle heifer, she's down. She's been down an hour, and the calf won't come, and she's screaming, and I don't know what to—" "Lantern," said Verena, already up, a shawl over her nightdress. "Walk fast, talk less." And she went out into the dark, behind the running boy faster than a woman her size had any right to move, a lantern swinging in her fist, and she got down in the wet grass behind that thrashing heifer, and she pushed up her sleeves over her great soft arms, and she went in. She had calved before. On a ranch in Nebraska where they let the cook do anything because the cook was big and strong and didn't complain, she had pulled more calves than she could count. She found the turned legs in the hot dark inside the animal, and she breathed slow and talked low to the heifer in her mother's tongue, and she worked the calf around with hands that were strong from a lifetime of being the one who carried the weight, and Toby held the lantern and prayed out loud, and at the gray edge of dawn a wet living calf slid out into the grass and shook its head and was alive. Wade found them there at first light, riding in off the south fence, and he reined up hard and sat his horse and looked down at the scene in the wet pasture, the cook on her knees in the bloody grass with her arms red past the elbow and a live calf in her lap and the saved heifer struggling up, and Toby Pratt staring at her as though she'd raised the dead. Wade got down. He knelt in the grass across from her, this big, tired man, and his eyes went from the calf to the bloodied woman who'd brought it living into the world, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. "Where'd you learn that?" he said finally. Not a sneer. The first real question he had ever asked her. "Nebraska," Verena said. She was breathing hard. There was blood on her face where she'd pushed her hair back. "They let the fat girl do the hard things there. I learned a great deal." And Wade Calloway, who had not laughed since March, looked at the live calf and the bloodied, dignified woman who'd saved it and made a sound that surprised them both. Short and rough and rusty from disuse, but a laugh, a real one. "Did they?" he said. "Did they now?" And he reached across the dead, tired space between them and took the calf from her lap so she could stand, and his scarred hand brushed her red one in the handing over, and neither of them said anything about that, but neither of them forgot it either. He started taking his supper in the cookhouse after that, not every night. But he'd come in, hat in his big, scarred hands, and sit at the end of the table the men had left to him and eat what she cooked among the men he led. And once or twice she caught him watching her move about the stove with a look on his face she couldn't read and didn't trust herself to read, because she was a hired cook with a dead man's deed sewn in her trunk, and she had not come here to be looked at like that. He found her in the garden one evening late in July, the dead wife's garden she had finished without asking, and he stood at the fence a while before she knew he was there, looking at the long, straight rows coming up green where his wife had staked them and died. "Mary planted that garden," Wade said finally. His voice was rough. "Staked every row of it the spring she never saw it come up." Verena straightened from the row, the trowel in her red hand. She had wondered if this would come, and how, and whether he'd hate her for it. "I know," she said. "Her stakes were still in the ground. I kept to them where I could. The pumpkins were her idea, not mine. I only finished what she started." Wade was quiet a long moment, looking at the rows. "Everybody else stepped around it," he said. 2 years. Couldn't look at it, couldn't touch it. You just finished it. A garden marked out and never planted is a thing half finished," Verena said simply. "A garden planted is supper. She would rather it fed you than stood empty, I think. Most women who plant would." He looked at her then, this big grieving man in the long gold light over the green rows. "You didn't ask me," he said. There was no anger in it. There was something underneath it that had no name yet. "You would have said no," Verena said, and then gone on stepping around it another 2 years. Some things a person should not be asked, only done and forgiven for. She bent back to the row. You may be angry if you like. The beans will still come up." And Wade Calloway, who had not been able to walk past that staked and empty ground for 2 years, stood at the fence and watched the heavy, plain new cook work his dead wife's garden into a living thing, and he found, to his own great surprise, that he was not angry at all. He was something else. He did not have the word for it yet. But he came back the next evening and waited at the rail again, and that time he opened the gate and came in and knelt down in the dirt across the row from her and pulled a weed, and neither of them said anything about it, and it was the first thing he had planted or tended since Mary died. There was one supper a week on that undid him entirely, and she had not meant it to. She had found, going through the dead woman's kitchen things, for she had to use those pots and crocks, there were no others, a recipe card in a careful hand, tucked in a tin, for an apple cake with brown sugar and cinnamon, the kind a woman copies from her own mother and means to make every fall. It had never been made. The card was clean, unspotted, set aside for a season that never came, and Verena, who had found a few early windfall apples under the half-wild tree by the creek, made the dead woman's cake one evening for the men's supper off the card, exactly as it was written. She did not think what it would do. Wade came in tired and took his place at the foot of the board, and she set the cake down warm, and the smell of it, apple and brown sugar and cinnamon, the smell of a particular woman's particular kitchen, reached him, and his hand stopped halfway to his fork. He went very still. He looked at the cake, and then his eyes found the card she'd left propped by the tin. His dead wife's writing and the big, tired man's face came apart in front of his crew just for a moment before he caught it. The men looked at their plates. Verena understood at once what she'd done, and she did not flinch from it, or flutter or apologize, as a smaller soul would have. She came and sat down in the empty chair beside him, uninvited, a thing a cook does not do, and she said, low, just to him, she wrote it down to make it. It waited in the tin for a fall that didn't come, so I made it for her. I hope that was not wrong. Wade did not trust his voice for a moment. Then he said, rough. It was her mother's. She talked about making it. Never, he stopped. Never got the fall. Verena finished gently. I know. Now it is made, and her men have eaten it, and it was good. That is what a recipe is for. It is the woman, still feeding the people she loved long after her hands are still. She put her big red hand flat on the table near his, not touching, just near. You may eat it or not. But it is not a wound, Wade. It is her, being kind to you one last autumn. Let her. And Wade Calloway picked up his fork and ate his dead wife's apple cake, made by the hands of the heavy, plain cook he'd almost turned away. And something in him that had been clenched shut since March eased open one more notch, and he could not have said that night whether it was grief going out of him or something new coming in, because in truth it was both, and they had begun to feel the same. She had come to learn whether he deserved the land, and every day she stayed, the answer got harder to hold at arm's length, because the answer was turning out to be yes. There was a dry lightning storm in early August that nearly took the whole answer away with the ranch. It came up fast and mean out of the southwest in the late afternoon, the sky going the color of a bruise, and it brought no rain at all, only wind and a hard cracking lightning that walked across the dry country striking sparks. And one of those sparks found the south grass, the very grass gone tinder dry that the men had let stand, and a line of fire stood up in the south pasture between the storm and the ranch. The men were scattered. Wade was miles off. Dell, when the smoke went up, did the thing small men do, which was freeze and then think about his horse and his own skin. And Crail and Boyd looked to Dell and froze with him. 4 men standing in the yard watching a grass fire come on the wind toward a barn full of hay and a house, and the whole grazing herd doing nothing because nobody had told them what to do. Verena did not wait to be told. She had seen prairie fire before, in Nebraska, where the cook was sent out with the men because the cook was strong, and she knew the one thing that beats a grass fire when you've no water and no time, which is to take its food away before it gets there. She came out of the cookhouse, already moving, a fat woman in a purple dress running heavy across the yard, and she wasted no breath at all on the frozen men. She went to the cleared garden, the only bare wet ground for a quarter-mile, and she saw the line of it, and she understood she could not save the south pasture, but she might save everything north of a line if she could only make the line. "Sacks!" she shouted, and her voice cut clean through the wind and the men's paralysis. "Wet sacks, the water trough, the plow. Toby, the plow team now. Mr. Sturgis, you will hitch it or you will get out of my way." And something in the sheer command of her, a fat cook bellowing orders in the smoke, broke the men out of their freeze the same as a slap breaks a feint. Toby ran for the team. Verena soaked grain sacks in the trough 2 at a time and flung them at Crail and Boyd, and she set the men to beating out the creeping front edge with the wet sacks while she did the thing none of them had thought of, got behind the plow team Toby brought up, and drove a wide furrow of turned bare earth across the path of the fire, a fire break, raw soil where the flame would find nothing to eat. She drove that team and that plow herself, a big woman, leaning her whole weight into the handles, hauling a black scar of bare ground across the grass between the fire and the ranch, the smoke in her lungs and the heat of it on her face, while the men beat the edges and Toby ran water, and when the fire reached a furrow, it ran up to the bare turned earth and found nothing, and lay down and died along the line she had cut. Wade came galloping in through the smoke as it was guttering out, having seen the fire from the far range and ridden his horse near to death to reach it, and he came into a yard of black-faced, exhausted men and a smoking dead fire line and a fat cook leaning on a plow she had just driven, soot to the elbows, her purple dress scorched at the hem, her breath sawing, and he took it in, the fire break, the beaten edges, the saved barn, and he got down off his blown horse and walked straight to her through the smoke. "Who cut the furrow?" Wade said. Nobody answered. Dell looked at the ground, and Toby Pratt, black with smoke to the eyes, said clear and proud, "She did, boss. She run the whole thing while the rest of us stood like posts. She cut the furrow and saved the barn." Wade looked at Verena a long moment in the settling smoke. "You drove a plow team into a grass fire," he said. "I drove it away from your hay," Verena said when she had breath. "There is a difference. Yours was about to burn. Now it is not." And she straightened off the plow handles, this enormous, soot-streaked woman, and looked him in the eye, unbowed. And Wade Calloway felt something move in his chest that he had thought the grief had killed for good, and he did not yet have a name for it, but he would. Dell Sturgis did not like it. Dell had run the Calloway ranches day to day for 6 years, and Dell had plans for the Calloway ranch that did not survive the owner sitting up of an evening at a warm table with a clear head, because a man with a warm table and a clear head starts paying attention, and Dell could not afford to be paid attention to. What Dell could not afford to have noticed, Verena had already noticed. She rose earlier than any man on the place, and one gray dawn in late July, she had been at the creek filling her water buckets when she saw the foreman, where no honest foreman is at that hour, out at the far gate, alone, cutting a half-dozen of the boss's unbranded yearlings out of the herd and hazing them quiet toward the road, where a stranger waited with money in his hand. She stood still in the willow shadow with her buckets and watched it all happen. The cattle changing hands, the coins changing hands, Dell pocketing the price of animals that were not his to sell. She had wondered where his easy money came from. Now she knew. He was bleeding the dying ranch from the inside, a few head at a time, betting it would fall before anyone counted close. She did not confront him. A hired woman with no standing does not accuse a foreman of rustling on her word alone and keep her place. And besides, she was learning a man, not running a ranch. Not yet. But she marked it, the date, and the number, and the look of the stranger, and she filed it away with everything else she was quietly learning in the corners of that place, and she carried her water back to the house and said nothing, and Dell never knew the heaviest, least regarded soul on the ranch had watched him steal in the dawn and forgotten not one detail of it. That, too, would come out before the end. So Dell did what small, mean men do when they feel the ground shift under a thing they mean to pick clean. He went after the cook. It started in words. At the table, in the yard, low remarks pitched for the other hands to catch. That she ate more than she was worth. That the boss was soft on her because a man gets lonely and isn't particular when he's broke. That a woman that fat in a country that hard wouldn't last the first real winter, and good riddance. Verena bore it as she bore bad weather, head down, unhurried, certain it would pass before she did. But one evening in August, Dell, who had been into a bottle and was sour about a deal of his that had soured first, leaned in as she set down the platter and said, loud enough for the whole table, "Tell me, fat girl, what's a sow like you doing on a man's ranch but eating it to the bone?" The cookhouse went quiet. Toby Pratt went white. And before Verena could decide whether to answer, a chair scraped, and Wade Calloway was on his feet at the end of the table. "Stand up, Dell," Wade said. He did not say it loud. That was the frightening thing. Dell stood, slow, the drink draining out of his face. "You'll beg her pardon," Wade said, "and then you'll get your gear, and you'll be off my land by morning, and you'll thank me on the way out that I'm letting you ride off it with your teeth. Boss, her pardon, Dell, now, or I take the rest out of you in the yard." Dell looked around the table for an ally and found 4 men looking at their plates and one boy looking at him with open loathing, and he did the arithmetic of his courage and came up short. He turned to Verena. "Beg pardon," he said, the words like glass in his mouth. "It is taken," said Verena Hartman, quiet and unbowed, "and not worth much, but taken." And she picked up the empty platter and went to the stove, and her broad back was very straight, and only she knew that her heart was hammering hard against her ribs, not from the insult, which was old and dull, but from the sight of that tired, gentle man on his feet, with his fists ready to defend her in front of his crew. Nobody had stood up for Verena Hartman in this country before. Nobody had ever bet a single coin on her being worth the standing up for. Dell rode off the next dawn. He did not ride far. He rode to the town of Ashfork, and he sat in the back of the saloon, and he nursed his grudge in his bottle, and within the week he had found his way to the one man in the county with a reason to take an interest, the banker, Mr. Pruitt, who held the paper on the Callaway place and stood to take the whole spread and every one of the 600 head for the price of a missed payment, and who was very interested indeed to learn from a bitter ex-foreman exactly how broke and how friendless and how ripe the Callaway ranch had become. But that is the trouble running its course, and I promised you the deed. Here, then, is how it came to be sewn in the lining of a fat cook's trunk. Come back with me to Kansas City, to the private dining room above a loud street, to the last winter of August Brandt's life. The old man had been failing for a year. His hand shook so he could not cut his meat, and the German family who ran the hotel had no patience for a slow, rich old man who frightened the other guests with his temper, and they would have turned him out, but for the fact that he paid in gold, and the fat cook had taken him on as her own particular charge, and saw to it he was fed soft and warm, and never hurried. Verena did not do it for the gold. She never saw most of it. She did it because the old man was alone, as she was alone, a person the world had decided to be done with. And she knew that particular cold, and she would not add to it. August Brandt talked to her as the dying talk, in long unspooling pieces, on the nights his pain led him. He talked about the land. I built that place out of nothing, he told her one night, the spoon idle in his shaking hand. After the war, 2 hands in a borrowed wagon and more spite than sense. Dug the first wells myself. Ran the first cattle off my own back. Named the brand for a man I loved. Callaway, my partner, dead 40 years now. The best of me went in the ground with him, and I've been honoring a corpse ever since and forgotten why. He set the spoon down. And then I got old, big girl, old and hard. There's a boy out west runs it for me now. My dead partner's nephew came to me with nothing in his pockets but his name, and worked himself half to death, and asked for one thing only, the chance to buy the place honest, on the time, and earn it. And you let him, Verena said. I let him. Brandt's mouth twisted. And I'll tell you the rest, since you've a face that doesn't run. He's a better man than me, August Brandt told the cook one night, his voice gone to gravel. That's the sin of it. I kept the deed in my coat to spite him, held it over him 8 years, let him pour his whole life into ground I never signed over, because I am a small old man, and it was the only way I could still matter to anyone. He thinks he's buying it from me on the time. He's killing himself to make the payments to a bank that doesn't even hold it. I hold it. I hold it all. And I am going to die with it in my coat just to make him grieve me, the way I've grieved every other thing I ever loved. He laughed, and it turned to coughing. I am not a good man, Verena. You feed a wicked old man soft eggs, and you think there's good in him. There isn't. There's just you. And Verena Hartman, who had been called a sow and a burden and a fat girl in 4 states, looked at the rich, wicked old man who had just confessed the meanest thing in his heart to her in the lamplight, and she said the thing that changed both their lives. Then give it back, she said. You are dying, Mr. Brandt. Take it out of your coat and give the man his land. You cannot take the spite with you, but you could take the one decent thing you ever did. The old man was quiet a long while, studying her face. And who'd see it done? he said at last. Who'd carry it to him? Who'd I trust to put it in his hand and not sell it out from under him the second I'm in the ground? Not a lawyer, not my own blood, what's left of them. They'd burn it for the insurance and run the cattle off. There's not a soul on this earth I'd trust with a thing this size. He stopped. His shaking hand found her broad red one on the table. Except, he said slowly, the one person in this whole greedy city who's been kind to me and never once asked me for a thing. I don't want your land, Verena said, alarmed. I am a cook. I know you don't want it, said August Brant. That is exactly why you're the only one who can be trusted to carry it. And he began, with great difficulty, to take the oilskin square out of the breast of his coat. I will not give you the whole of that night yet, not the part where he made her swear, not the condition he laid on the deed, not the thing he made her promise about Wade Calloway that explains everything she did afterward. That is the keystone, and the keystone goes in last. But I will tell you how the old man went, because she was there, and it matters. He lasted 3 weeks past the signing. The German family had him out of the good rooms and up under the eaves by then, now that his money was spoken for and his usefulness done, and they would have let him die alone but for the fat cook who climbed the back stairs every night after her shift and sat with him. He went on a cold, clear night in March with his shaking hand in her red one, and near the end, when the fear came on him as it comes on all the dying, he gripped her hand hard and said, Have I done a good thing, big girl? Tell me I did one good thing. And Verena, who did not lie even in mercy, looked at him and was able to say, You did, Mr. Brant, the best one I will see at home. And the old man let his breath out slow and was easier after that, and a little before dawn he was gone, and the only soul in Kansas City who wept for August Brant was the heaviest, plainest, kindest woman he had ever underestimated and at the last trusted with everything. She buried him with the little of his money the family hadn't already gotten their hands on, and then a fat immigrant cook who had never owned more than a trunk and 3 books walked out of Kansas City carrying, folded into the bottom of that trunk in its wrap of oiled cloth, the deed to the Calloway Ranch, and a promise that bound her hands. That was why she had come west. That was why she had taken a cook's wage on the very land she legally owned. She had come to keep a deathbed promise, to find out with her own eyes, before she breathed a word, whether Wade Calloway was the man the dying old man had sworn he was. Because the condition August Brant laid on the deed was a hard one, and Verena would not discharge it on hearsay. She would discharge it on the truth, and the truth by that August, after the calf and the standing up and 100 suppers, was breaking her heart in the best and worst way, because she had her answer, and her answer meant she would have to give away the land and tell the truth and almost certainly leave. For who keeps a cook once she's handed you a whole ranch and a reason to feel beholden? She had not come for love, but she had found the man worth keeping the promise for, and keeping it would cost her the one place she had ever wanted to stay. She was still turning that over, that warm August, the deed safe in the lining, and the answer heavy in her chest, when the trouble Del Sturgis had carried to town came riding back up the Calloway Road in a banker's coat. It came in stages, as ruin always does. First a letter, formal and cold, reminding Wade Calloway that the note on the property fell due at first frost, and that the bank, meaning Mr. Pruitt, would expect payment in full or would take the secured property, being the land and all stock thereon 600 head. No extensions, no mercy. The law is the law. Wade read it at the cookhouse table with his face like stone, and Verena, pouring his coffee, read it over his shoulder without seeming to, and felt the floor of the summer drop out from under them both. "How bad?" she said. "Just that." "Bad," Wade said. "Cattle won't bring half what we owe, not green and small the way they are. I've known it was coming, hoped for a good fall." He laughed, short and bitter, nothing like the rusty real laugh in the pasture. "There's no good fall coming." "How much short?" "Enough that it don't matter," Wade said, and folded the letter, and Verena watched him fold up his whole life with it, and the deed, in the lining of her trunk 50 yards away, burned in her mind like a coal, because she could end this in a single sentence. She could walk to the trunk and pull the oilskin square and lay it on the table and say, "This is yours. It was always yours. The old man gave it back. There is no note. There is no bank that can touch this ground, because the bank's paper is a lie, and the true paper is mine to give you." She could save him with one breath, and she did not yet, because of the promise, because of the condition August Brant had laid on the deed with the last strength in his shaking hand, the condition I have not yet told you, and because, until that condition was met, the deed in her trunk was a key that would not turn. She set down the coffee pot. "We will think of something," she said. "There's no something to think of," Wade said gently, looking up at her, and the gentleness was the worst of it. "You've been good to this place, Verena, better than it deserved. You ought to start thinking where you'll go before the frost. I'd write you a character, would get you the best kitchen in Denver. You earned that and more." "I am not thinking about Denver," Verena said. "You ought to." "I am thinking," she said, "about your cattle." And she went back to the stove with her heart pounding and a plan beginning to turn over in her mind, because there was a thing she could do that did not break the promise, a thing that was hers to do as a cook and a woman, and not as the secret holder of a deed. She could fight to save the herd honestly on its own merits and by the time the condition needed, and she set herself to it. What she did over the next 6 weeks, before the banker ever came in person, was quiet and enormous, and not one of the men understood it while it happened. She had learned the cattle would sell ordinary because the calves came small, and the herd carried disease in its feet from a wet, boggy pasture nobody had drained, a low corner where the spring runoff stood and soured and rotted the cattle's feet, so that the herd limped and lost weight and would fetch a sick man's price at the fall sale. The men knew the bog was a problem. The men had known for 2 years. It was a big, ugly job and nobody's particular task, and so, as such jobs always go, it never got done. Verena did it. She found a survey of the ground with her eye, where the water wanted to run if only it were given a path to the creek, and one gray dawn before the cooking, she took a borrowed spade out to the low corner and began to dig. A ditch, a drainage cut, from the standing water to the creek 100 yards off, through clay that fought the spade every foot. She dug an hour that first morning and went in to cook breakfast with her hands shaking, and she went back at dusk and dug another hour, and the next dawn another, a big woman alone in a bog at first light with a spade, opening the earth a foot at a time. Toby found her at it on the third morning and stood watching a while. "That's a 4-man job, miss." "Then I am behind by 3, Verena said, and drove the spade in again. and had best not waste the daylight talking about it. He looked at the cut and at her, and then without a word he went and got the other spade and got down in the cut beside her and dug, and after that there were two of them. They dug that ditch over 20 mornings and 20 dusks, the boy and the heavy woman, through clay and root and one stretch of buried rock they had to break out by hand, and they talked while they dug low about cattle and weather and the dead. "You put me in mind of my mother," Toby said once, halfway down a hard morning. "She was a big woman, too, strong. Folks were unkind about it, and she never once let it land on her. Died when I was 14, and the place went to the bank, and I've been drifting since." "She sounds a woman worth being put in mind of," Verena said. "And here you are, digging a ditch nobody told you to dig, to save a herd that isn't yours, for a man who can't pay you. She raised you right, Toby Pratt, before the bank ever got the chance to raise you wrong." And the boy dug on with his jaw working and his eyes bright, and a friendship grew in that ditch that would outlast everything. And on the 20th day the cut reached the creek, and Verena drove her spade through the last foot of bank, and the standing water in the low corner found its path at last and began to run, draining away clear and steady, and within a fortnight the bog was firm ground, and the foot rot in the herd began to dry up and clear, and the cattle stopped limping and started, for the first time in 2 years, to gain. She had learned that the calves came small, because the herd had no improvement bull, and the cows were bred to a tired old scrub past his use, and here she did a thing that cost her more than the ditch or the fire, because it cost her the only safety a poor woman has, which is the little money under the mattress that stands between her and the cold. She had saved every coin of every wage she had ever been paid, scrubbing and cooking across 4 states in 10 years, sewn into a stocking, and she had most of the little gold August Brant had pressed on her despite her in those last months, gold she had meant never to touch. It was not much. To a cattleman it was nothing. To Verena Hartman it was everything. It was Denver if the frost came and the ranch fell and she had to start over. It was the difference between a kitchen job and the poorhouse if her knees gave out. It was the whole of her cushion against a world that had never once cushioned her. And she counted it out one night by candle in the cookhouse, all of it, and she made up her mind to spend it on a bull. She did not tell Wade. She knew he would never take it, and she knew the herd would die green and small without it. So she went to shy Toby Pratt, the one hand on that ranch she trusted, and she put the money in his hand wrapped in a cloth and said, "There is a man 2 days south near Cedar Wells, with good Durham blood and a note coming due of his own. He will sell a young bull cheap to a buyer with cash in hand. You will go and buy the soundest one your eye can find, and you will tell no one whose money it was. And if anyone asks, you will say a neighbor sold him on the time. Can you do that for me, Toby?" The boy looked at the cloth-wrapped money, and he understood, he was young but not a fool, that the cook was handing him her whole life savings to save the boss's cattle, and that she meant to let the boss never know. "Miss," he said, and his voice cracked, "this is all you got. This is your whole—" "You can't—" "I can," Verena said, "and I am. Go on, Toby, before I lose the nerve to be foolish." He went 2 days south to Cedar Wells and 2 days back, and on the 5th evening he came up the Callaway Road leading a young red Durham bull, sound in the foot and deep in the chest and built to throw big calves, bought for a song off a man as desperate as they were. Verena went out to meet him in the dusk and ran her hands over the animal in the lantern light. The legs, the back, the wide, good frame of him. Sound, she murmured, more to herself than the boy. Good bone. He'll do. Man at Cedar Wells said I had a good eye, Toby said, glowing. Said the cook who sent me knew her cattle. I didn't tell him you were the cook. I said what you told me to say. And what was that? That a neighbor was selling on the time. The boy's face fell a little. It's wrong, miss. Lying to the boss. He's been good to me. It is not a lie that hurts him, Toby. It is a kindness that spares him. There is a difference, and you will learn it as you get older. She put the bull in among the cows herself the next morning and told no one where the money came from, and let Wade believe, as she'd planned, that a neighbor had sold the bull on the time. She had learned the herd was thin because the lake grass was poor. So she walked the pastures and found the good grass the men had overlooked and moved the cattle to it, riding nothing, walking, a big woman on foot among the whole milling herd. Grass looks the same to me everywhere, missus, Crail said, watching her push a stubborn cow uphill with her shoulder. How do you know that corner's better? It is greener where the water sits longest, and the cattle have not yet cropped it, Verena said, not stopping. You have ridden past it all summer. A thing you ride past you stop seeing. A thing you walk past you learn. And the hands laughed at the sight of her until the cattle started to fill out on that overlooked grass. And then they stopped laughing and started quietly to do what she said, and she cooked. Through all of it, the ditching and the bull and the moving of the herd, she fed 5 men 3 times a day and never let the table go thin, and the Callaway Ranch, which had been dying since March, began slowly, against all sense, to come back to a pulse. The hands turned to her one by one, and the day Boyd's turn came, he nearly lost a hand for it. He was stringing new wire on the south fence when a strand let go under strain, and the barbed end whipped back and laid his forearm open to the bone, a long, ugly tear pouring blood, and Crail got him up onto the wagon, white as paper, and drove him in at a gallop, shouting for the boss, who was 4 miles out. So Crail, who had laughed about draft horses in the spring, did the thing nobody on that ranch would have done in the spring. He drove straight to the cookhouse and shouted for the cook. Verena had Boyd up on the scrub table in a moment, his arm over a basin, and the blood moved her no more than it had at the calving. She had a kettle always hot. She washed the wound clean, and she took her own good needle and the silk thread from her sewing box, and she stitched the torn arm shut, small and even, every stitch set as careful as a seam, talking low to the gray-faced man the whole time to keep him with her, and she packed it with a poultice of the herb she'd grown in the garden out back and bound it clean. Boyd watched the fat cook sew his arm back together with the same steady hands that made his bread, and when it was done and bound, he looked at her, this rough man who had laughed at her, and said the only thing he could find. "Reckon I owe you an arm, missus?" "You owe me a clean shirt," Verena said, "for I have ruined that one. Keep the arm. Use it kinder than your mouth has been." And Boyd laughed, a real laugh, and went red. Crail, who had carried his bleeding partner in at a gallop and stood white against the wall through the whole of it, found his voice at last. "I said a thing about a draft horse in the spring, missus. I take it back. Whole thing. I take it all the way back." "It is a long way to carry a thing like that all summer," Verena said, not unkindly, threading her needle away. "Set it down. We have cattle to feed." And from that day, there were 3 on the place who'd have walked through fire for her. The boy, and Boyd, and Crail. And the laughing in the bunkhouse stopped for good, because it is hard to mock the woman who sewed your friend's arms shut on her own supper table. Wade saw it. He could not help but see it. He saw the foot rot clear and the calves start to grow and the herd move to good grass, and his thin cattle begin, week by week, to put on the weight that might make the difference at the fall sale between losing everything and losing a little less. And he saw that the woman at the center of it was the fat hired cook he'd almost sent back down the road in the spring, and something in Wade Calloway that had been shut since his wife died began, very slowly and against his every effort to stop it, to open. He took her to town with him in September for the autumn supplies, the 2 of them on the wagon bench, and it was in the dusty street of Ash Fork that Wade Calloway first stood up for her in front of strangers, which is a different and harder thing than standing up for someone among your own. They were loading flour outside the mercantile when a knot of town men by the rail took their measure. The broke rancher everyone knew was finished, and the enormous Dutch cook on his wagon, and one of them, a loud man with a store-bought coat, said, "Plenty loud enough to carry. There's Calloway's last asset. Reckon when the bank takes the place, they'll have to weigh her by the hundredweight to move her." And the men laughed, the easy, ugly laugh of men who are safe and bored. Verena, on the wagon bench, did not change her face. She had heard it in a dozen towns. But Wade set down the flour sack he was carrying, slow, and walked over to the rail, and the laughing stopped, as laughing always stops when a quiet, dangerous-looking man crosses the street toward you. "That woman," Wade said, not loud, "drained my south pasture by hand, cut a fire break that saved my barn, stitched a man's arm shut when he'd have bled out waiting on a doctor, bought a bull out of her own pocket to save a herd that wasn't hers." He looked along the row of them. "What have you done this season worth saying out loud? Any of you?" Silence. The loud man's face went red. "Didn't think so. You'll keep her name out of your mouths, or the next man laughs can explain it to me direct." And he turned his back on them, which is its own kind of insult to men like that, and went back to his flour. Verena watched it all from the wagon bench, and when he climbed back up beside her, she did not thank him, because some things are too big to thank a man for in a public street. She only said low, "You did not have to do that." "I know it," Wade said, gathering the reins. "Wanted to." And he clucked to the team, and they rode home in the long gold afternoon, not touching and not talking, and both of them very aware of the few inches of wagon bench between them, which had begun somewhere on the road to feel like the most charged few inches in the territory. He found her at the drained pasture at dusk one September evening, leaning on the spade, looking at the cattle grazing the cleared ground, and he stood beside her at the rail a while in the gold light without saying anything, as he had taken to doing of an evening. "You did all this," Wade said. It wasn't a question. The men did it. "The men did it because you shamed them into it by doing it first," Wade said. "I've watched you carry water a mule wouldn't, and dig a ditch a road crew wouldn't, and put a bull in my herd I know I never bought." He turned and looked at her in the dying light, this big, tired, gray-eyed man, and his weathered face was open in a way she had never seen it. "Where'd that bull come from, Verena?" "A neighbor." "There's no neighbor," Wade said quietly. "I know every man in this county, and not one of them sold me a bull. You bought it with your own money, the wages I never paid you and whatever you'd saved besides. You spent your getaway on my cattle." His voice caught. "A fat hired cook I couldn't pay spent her last dollar to save a broke man's herd and let him think it was a neighbor's kindness so he wouldn't have to feel it. Why?" And Verena Hartman, who had a deed sewn in her trunk and a promise on her hands and an answer in her heart she had been afraid to look at straight, looked at him in the gold light and could not lie to that open face. "Because," she said, "I have spent my whole life being the one nobody bet a coin on, and I came to this place, and I found a man who bet his last coin on his hands and his cattle and a calf in the dark, and never on himself, and I wanted—" She stopped. Her broad face was very steady, but her eyes were not. "I wanted to lay my own coin down on you," she said. "That is all. A fat girl wanted once to be the one who wagered on somebody. You needn't make more of it." Wade Calloway held her eyes a long moment in the last of the light. "I'll make exactly as much of it as it's worth," he said low, "which is everything." He did not kiss her, because he was not that kind of man, and it was not that kind of moment, but he reached over and took her big red work roughened hand off the top of the spade and held it in both of his scarred ones, the way you hold something you've decided not to let go of, and they stood at the rail in the dark, and the cattle she had saved grazed the ground she had drained on the land that, though he did not know it, she already owned, and for the length of that held hand neither of them was alone. She nearly told him then, the deed, the old man, all of it. The words were in her throat, but the promise stopped her. The condition was not met, not quite. And Verena Hartman did not break her word to the dead, not even for the living she had come to love. So she held his hand and held her tongue, and the secret stayed hidden in the cedar trunk one night longer. It would not stay there much longer, because the next morning the banker came. Mr. Pruitt came up the Calloway Road in a hired buggy, with Del Sturgis riding alongside on a borrowed horse, and the sight of the two of them together told Wade everything before a word was spoken. The banker who held his ruin and the foreman who'd carried it to him come to watch the kill. It was 3 weeks ahead of Frost. Pruitt had not come to wait for the due date. He had come, with Dell's poison in his ear about how broke and friendless the place had become, to break Wade early, to seize before the fall sale could save him, to take 600 head while they were worth taking, and the man was too beaten to fight. He stepped down from the buggy in his town coat and his tall hat, with his seizure papers in a leather case, and he looked around the Calloway yard, at the cleared pasture and the filling cattle and the mended look of the place, with the faint irritation of a man who'd been told he was coming to a corpse and found something with a pulse. "Calloway," Pruitt said, "I'll come to it. The bank's calling the note today." "It's not due till Frost," Wade said. He'd come out onto the porch. He was very still. "The note has an acceleration clause on insecurity," Pruitt said, "and I've been given to understand the property's insecure. Failing management, no capital, a workforce of children, and—" He glanced toward the cookhouse, where the cook had come to the door, drawn by the buggy. "And that. I'm within my rights. Pay the balance in full by sundown, or I take the secured property. The land and the 600 head, the cattle today. I've a buyer's man bringing a crew this afternoon to drive them off." You can't drive a man's herd off 3 weeks early on a clause, Wade said, and his voice was low and dangerous now, the gentleness gone. I'll have the law on you. I am the nearest thing to the law this county has within 2 days' ride, Pruitt said, and the law is the law. Sundown Callaway, the full balance, or the herd walks at dusk, and the land's posted by Monday. He looked for the first time fully at the cook in the cookhouse doorway, the heaviest woman he'd ever seen, an apron over a purple dress, flour on her broad forearms, and he dismissed her with his eyes in the half-second it took to decide she was nothing. A fat servant, part of the failing inventory, something to be cleared off with the rest. And you'll want to start clearing your people off the property, he added, not even to her, about her. The stock and the help both. And that, the morning I opened on, the boot print on the clean floor, the fat cook on her knees, that was where we began. Now you know how every road led to it. Now you know what lay folded in that trunk, and whose name was on it, and why she had not yet spoken. And now you will see her speak. Because Mr. Pruitt, waiting on his answer, walked into the cookhouse to get out of the sun and tracked his town boot across the floor Verena had scrubbed white at dawn, and turned to the fat servant on her knees with the brush in her hand, and said, You're help, not stock. You'll be off by sundown like the rest of the worthless lot. Don't make me send a man to put you off. Verena set down the brush. She rose, and a woman that large rising slow to her full height in a small room is a thing that takes a moment and fills it. And she wiped her red hands on her apron, and she looked at the banker, and for the first time since she had walked up that road, she let her face show what was behind it, which was not a servant's face at all. I will not be off by sundown, Mr. Pruitt, she said, in her low, even voice with the old country in it. And neither will the cattle, and neither, I think, will you take this land, because you have not got the right paper, and I have. Pruitt stared at her. Then he laughed, short and incredulous. The cook, he said. The cook is going to lecture me on paper. Wade, Verena said, not loud, not taking her eyes off the banker. Come inside, and bring no one. There is a thing I must show you, and it is past time. Wade came in. Dell crowded the doorway behind him, and Toby Pratt behind Dell, and the other hands gathering in the yard, drawn by the strangeness of it. And Verena Hartman walked to the corner of the cookhouse, where her battered trunk sat against the wall. She had never moved it to the bunkroom, never let it out of her sight, and now they understood she had not. And she knelt, and she opened it, and she lifted out the spare apron and the good winter shawl and the 3 books, and she ran her thumb along the cedar bottom and found the stitches she had sewn herself 9 months before, and she broke them with her thumbnail, one by one, in a silence so total the whole ranch could hear the threads pop. And she drew out a flat square of oiled cloth, soft with handling, and she stood, and she unfolded it on the white scrubbed table in front of the banker, and the rancher, and the foreman, and the boy, and inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, filed and witnessed and signed, and she smoothed it flat with her red hand and stepped back so they could read it. That is the deed to this land, Verena said. The true one, the original, filed in the territorial office under the old survey, witnessed and signed by the man who built this place, August Brandt, who held it back from every soul for 8 years out of spite and gave it away at the last out of the one decent thing left in him. Rid whose name he signed it over to. Read it, Wade. Wade Calloway bent over the table, and his scarred finger moved down the page, and he found the line, and he went white to the lips, and his finger stopped, and he could not speak. So Verena said it for him. "He signed it to me," she said quietly. "Verena Hartman, not a copy, not a claim. The deed, the whole of it, the land and the water and the timber and every acre. It has been mine in the eyes of the law since the winter before I ever came up your road. I have owned this ranch the entire time I have cooked on it." She turned to the banker, and her voice did not rise, and that was the terrible power of it. "And your note, Mr. Pruitt, the note you have been bleeding this man on for 8 years, was written against a deed August Brant never had the right to pledge, because he had already, in his sound mind and before 2 witnesses, signed the land away. There is no security behind your note. There never was. You have been collecting payments on ground you have no lien against and no power to seize. You cannot take 600 head off my land. You cannot post my land by Monday. You have, in fact, a very great deal of explaining to do to whatever bank you have been telling that this paper was good." The cookhouse was utterly silent. Del Sturgis found his voice first, ugly and disbelieving. "She's lying. A fat cook with a forged deed. Pruitt, she can't." "It is filed, Mr. Sturgis," Verena said without looking at him. "Witnessed and recorded under seal in the territorial office. A forgery does not survive the record book. Send to the Capitol and read it for yourself. I will wait. I have waited 9 months. I can wait 2 more for the post." She turned back to Pruitt, who had gone a sick gray under his tall hat, because Pruitt, unlike Dell, understood exactly what a recorded prior deed did to a lien, and understood that the fat servant he had dismissed with half a glance had just, in 4 plain sentences, ended him. "You knew," Pruitt said hoarsely. A recorded prior conveyance. If this is real, my note is worthless," Verena said. "Yes, as worthless as you took me to be. Funny, is it not, how a thing can be worth nothing right up until the moment it is worth everything?" She folded the deed, slow in front of him with great care, back into its oilskin square, and the soft sound of that folding was the loudest thing in the room. "Go home, Mr. Pruitt. Call off your buyer's crew. Tear up your note or do not. It will tear up the same in any court in the territory. And the next time a bitter man rides into your office to sell you a broke neighbor's ruin, you might ask yourself who really holds the paper before you come to take the cattle off a woman scrubbing her own floor." Mr. Pruitt looked at the folded oilskin in the fat cook's red hand as if it were a live thing. He opened his mouth and shut it, and then, because there was nothing in the world he could say to a recorded prior deed, he turned and walked out of the cookhouse and across the yard he had come to seize, and got up into his hired buggy without a word, and drove down the Calloway Road at a pace that was almost a run. And he did not come back, not that day, not ever. And within the month it was known in 3 counties that the banker Pruitt had been collecting 8 years of payments against a lien that the record book said had never existed, and the explaining he had to do cost him his post and his good name both, which is its own kind of cattle, driven off at dusk. But the cattle were still under threat that afternoon, because the banker's word had gone out ahead of his ruin, and at 3 o'clock the buyer's man came up the Calloway Road with a crew of 6 riders to drive the 600 head off to the railhead as arranged. They came in hard and businesslike, dusty men with coiled whips and a contract, expecting a beaten rancher and a herd for the taking, and they found instead a yard where the banker's buggy had already fled and a big woman in a purple dress standing square in the gate. "Bank sent us for the Callaway herd," the buyer's man said, looking down at her from his horse. "Step aside, missus. We've a long drive and short light." "There is no Callaway herd for you," Verena said, and she did not step aside. "There is my herd on my land, and your bank holds no paper on either, which your Mr. Pruitt discovered this very hour to his cost. Lay one rope on one head of my cattle, and you are rustlers in any court in the territory, the whole crew of you, and I will name you to the brand inspector by sundown." She folded her red arms over her broad chest. "Ride to town and ask him, or stay and hang for a contract that was never worth the ink. But the cattle do not move." And then a thing happened that the buyer's man had not bargained for. It was not the woman alone in the gate. It was what came up out of the yard behind her and ranged itself at her shoulders without a word. Toby Pratt, who set himself at her right hand, and Boyd, the long scar still pink on his forearm, who took her left, and Crail beside him, and Wade Callaway last of all off the porch and down into the dust, with his hand resting easy near his revolver, until the big, immovable cook stood in that gate fronted by every soul on the ranch she had carried, fed, stitched, and saved through one long summer, and not one of them so much as shifted a boot. "You can drive to the railhead empty," Boyd said to the buyer's man, conversational, scratching at the pink scar on his arm, "or you can drive there in irons. Either road's a long one. Pick the one that don't end with the inspector." The buyer's man looked at the wall of them. He was a hired hand himself, not a fool, and he did the arithmetic of a man who has just been told the contract in his pocket might hang him. "We'll ride to town," he said at last, "and ask." And he wheeled his crew and rode back down the road to find a banker who was no longer in any condition to confirm anything, and the 600 head stayed on the grass Verena had moved them to, and not one hoof of the Callaway herd ever walked off that land at another man's order again. Del Sturgis had stood frozen in the doorway through all of it. His ally fled, his poison spent, ruin on the man he'd hoped to ruin reversed in a single morning by the cook he'd called a sow. He looked at the folded deed, and he looked at Wade's face, and he understood that there was no place for him here now, and never would be again, and he turned to slink for his borrowed horse. "Del," Wade said. Del stopped. "You sold my cattle on the side," Wade said, very quiet, "and I couldn't prove it, and I carried you anyway because times were hard for everyone." "I can prove it," Verena said. The room turned to her. Del went still. "A morning in late July," she said, even and quiet, looking straight at the foreman. 6 unbranded yearlings cut from the herd at the far gate before light, hazed to the road, and sold to a thin man on a roan for cash in your pocket. I was at the creek. I saw every coin of it, Mr. Sturgis. I have seen you go out alone in the dawn and come back with money 4 more times since, and I can name the dates, and a thin man on a roan is not hard to find when a brand inspector goes looking." She let that sit. "You thought no one watched the fat cook. That was always your mistake. Everyone tells the truth in front of a woman they've decided is nothing." Del's face went the color of ash. He had no answer, because there is no answer to a witness who kept count. "There it is," Wade said softly. 2 years I couldn't prove, and she had you cold from her first July." He looked back at Del. "You rode to town and sold my whole life to that banker so you could pick the bones, And the woman you called a sow at my table," his voice shook just once, "is the only reason there's a ranch left for you to have betrayed. Get off my land." He stopped, looked at Verena. Something passed between them, fast and wordless. "Off her land," he corrected low. "Before I forget I'm a decent man." Del Sturgis got on his borrowed horse and rode down the Callaway Road after the banker, and was not seen in that county again either, and good riddance. And the cookhouse let out a breath, and shy Toby Pratt, 19 years old, looked at the fat cook who had drained the pasture and bought the bull and saved the calf, and now, it turned out, owned the very ground they stood on, and said, in a voice full of wonder, "You're the missus. You been the missus the whole time and scrubbed our floors and dug our ditch." And he laughed, delighted, the pure laugh of the young at a wonderful joke the world had played, and one by one the other hands began to laugh too, not at her, never again at her, but at themselves, at the size of what they had missed, at the months they had spent underestimating the owner of the Callaway Ranch, while she carried their water and patched their floor and let them. But it was not finished. 2 things remained, the smaller and the larger, and Verena, who had carried this 9 months, meant to set them both down before the day was out. The smaller thing first. When the yard had cleared and the hands had gone back to the cattle still buzzing, Wade Callaway stood alone with Verena in the cookhouse, the deed folded on the table between them, and his face was not the face of a man saved. It was the face of a man trying to understand something that hurt. "All this time," he said, "the note, the 8 years, the payments that were killing me, you owned it. You could have told me the first night, and I'd have—" "You would have what?" Verena said gently. "Wept with relief, and thanked me, and felt, every day after, that you owed me your land and your life, and could never look at me plain again. You'd have made me a benefactor, Wade, a fat angel who fell out of the sky with a deed, and I did not come for that." She put her hand flat on the oilskin. "Let me tell you the night he signed it, and then you will understand why I could not." And she told him. She told him about the last hard week of February, the old man failing fast, the cough gone down into his chest, the German family who ran the hotel hovering like crows because a rich man dying owes somebody money, and they meant it to be them. She told him how Brant sent for her one night past midnight, when his pain had eased enough to let him think, and how she came up to the cold, dim room with a candle and found the old man propped on his pillows with the oilskin square already out of his coat and lying on the counterpane under his shaking hand. "He'd sent for a lawyer that afternoon," Verena said. "A real one, paid, with a witness book. The man was waiting in the hall, and Brant looked at me, and he said, 'Sit down, big girl. I'm going to do a wicked thing or a decent one, I can't tell which, and I want it done in front of the only honest face I've got left.' And he had the lawyer brought in, and he signed it. His hand shook, so the lawyer had to steady his wrist, but he signed the land over, all of it, the whole Callaway Ranch, away from the bank's paper and his own kin, and clear over to—" She stopped. "To me, to my name. And I argued, Wade. I stood in that cold room, and I told a dying man he was a fool, that I was a cook, that I did not want a kingdom of grass and could not hold it and would not take it. And he closed his shaking hand over mine on the deed, and he said the thing that has kept me silent these 9 months." She drew a breath. He said, "I'm not giving you the land, Verena. I'm giving you the choosing of who gets it. There's a man out west I wronged for 8 years, out of pure spite, my dead partner's nephew, Wade Calloway, who's pouring his life into my dirt, believing he's buying it honest. I told myself for 8 years he was a grasping boy after my money. He's not. He's a better man than me, and I knew it. And I held the deed over him anyway because hurting the good was the only power a wicked old man had left. I'm dying with that on me. So here is your charge. And it is the only thing I have ever asked of anyone who didn't owe me. Verena's voice was very steady now, reciting words she had carried 9 months and worn smooth with carrying. He said, "Take the deed, go to him, but do not put it in his hand on my say-so. I'm a liar, and I was wrong about him for 8 years, and my word is worth nothing. Go and look with your own eyes, hire on, cook in his house. Watch how he treats the lowest soul on the place, the boy, the hands, the animals, anyone who can do nothing for him." And then her steady voice finally caught. And then he looked at me, at all of me, the size of me, the plainness, and he said the cruelest, kindest thing anyone ever said to me. He said, "And watch how he treats you. A woman the world's already decided is worthless, the fattest, plainest, least bet upon soul I know. If a man's good only to people who can repay him, he's not good. Go be the person who can't repay him and see what he does. And if he treats you the way I never treated anyone, then he's earned my land, and you give it to him, and not one day before. And if he doesn't, you keep it, and you live like a queen, and you'll have earned that too. Either way, you'll be free of being nobody, which is the only thing I can give you that's worth giving." Wade stared at her. "The woman the world's decided is worthless," he repeated slowly. He meant me," Verena said simply. "He sent the test in the door himself, though he never lived to know how it came out. He sent me to your gate, the one soul who could do nothing for you, who you could mock or dismiss or work to the bone and never pay a price for it, to see what you'd do when you thought I was nothing. And you," her steady voice finally went just at the edge, "you stood up at your own table in front of your own crew and put a man off your land for calling me a sow. You held my hand at the pasture rail. You asked where I learned to pull a calf instead of laughing that I had. You passed his test 100 times over and never knew you were sitting it. The land is yours, Wade Calloway. It has been yours in my heart since the night you laughed in the bloody grass. The paper just had to catch up to the truth." And she pushed the folded oilskin deed across the white table to him, the whole ranch in one soft square of paper, the way you'd pass a man the salt. Wade did not pick it up. He looked at the deed, and then he looked up into her face. And the largest thing, the thing Verena had been most afraid of, the reason she'd half believed she'd have to leave the moment the truth was out, came due. He pushed the deed back across the table to her, slow, deliberate, until it sat exactly between them. "No," Wade said. "Wade, you listen to me now, Verena Hartman, because I've let you do the talking all this long season, and it's my turn." He came around the table. He took her big red hands in his scarred ones, both of them, and he held on. "I don't want the land handed to me. Not by a bank, not by a dead man, not even by you. I never did. I wanted to earn a place and a life and somebody to share it with, and I poured 8 years into this dirt believing that's what I was doing, and it turns out the dirt was already yours and the 8 years were—" He stopped, steadied. "The 8 years were me earning you and not knowing it, so I'm not taking the deed off you. I won't have your land." He drew a breath. "I'll have you if you'll have me, and then it's ours, the both of it, and no man living can say I bought it or you gave it, or that either one of us came to the other with empty hands. Marry me, not for the ranch. The ranch can burn. I've waited my whole life to find one person who'd bet a coin on me, and she walked up my road on foot to spare a mule, and I've loved her since the calf and been too broke and too proud and too scared to say it. Stay, you belong here. You've belonged here since the first night you lit my cold stove. Be my wife. The cookhouse was very quiet and very warm in the late gold light, and the deed lay folded on the white table between them, no longer a secret, no longer a key, just a piece of paper about dirt, which was the least valuable thing in the room. You are a foolish man, Verena Hartman said, and her voice broke clean in two, and the tears she had not let any banker see ran down her broad, kind face at last. To turn down 40,000 acres for a fat cook. I'm not turning anything down, Wade said. I'm getting both. I'm just doing it in the right order. And he smiled, the rusty, real smile, the pasture smile, and he was still holding both her hands. Say it, Verena. Say you'll stay. I will stay, she said. I will stay, and I will have you, you stubborn, decent, beautiful man, though I came here to give the land away and leave, and you have ruined that entirely. Good, said Wade Calloway, and he kissed her, finally, in the warm cookhouse, with the deed forgotten on the table, and the saved cattle lowing in the dusk outside, a big, tired gentleman, and the heaviest, kindest, least bet upon woman in the territory, who had owned the ground beneath their feet the whole time, and given it away for love, and been given it back twice over. They were married in Ash Fork 3 weeks later, the week before the frost that was to have ruined them. The town came, the whole of it, the town that had laughed when the fat cook walked off the freighter in the spring, come now in its Sunday best to see her wed the rancher, because the story had run through 3 counties by then and changed in the running, as stories do, and now everyone had always known there was something about that big Dutch girl. Everyone had always said so. They came to see the cook who held the deed. The woman a banker had ridden up to evict, who turned out to own the ground he stood on, and they crowded the little frame church and spilled out the door. Verena saw the change in them and was not fooled by it, and forgave it anyway, because that is the kind of soul she was. There was a Mrs. Ackerman, the grocer's wife, who had refused Verena credit her first week in the country, and said to her face that she did not extend it to transients of a certain size. And Mrs. Ackerman came up the church steps now with both hands out and her eyes wet, saying, "Verena, dear, you must let me give you a proper kitchen account. Anything you need, anything at all." And Verena took the woman's hands because she would not be small in return for smallness, and said only gently, "Thank you, Mrs. Ackerman. I find my credit is good now," and let the woman blush at her own reflection in that, which was punishment enough and more merciful than the woman deserved. There was old Pruitt's clerk from the bank, who had once been sent to nail the first notice to the Calloway gate, standing red-faced at the back, having come to see with his own eyes the woman who had unmade his master. There were Crail and Boyd, scrubbed and uncomfortable in collars, who had laughed about draft horses in the spring, and now stood with their hats over their hearts, having long since stopped laughing. And there was Toby Pratt, scrubbed pink and bursting with pride, standing up beside Wade as his man, having traveled the whole road with them from the night of the calf. The old women of the town, who had been the quickest to judge Verena's size, were the first to weep at the wedding, the way such women so often are. The ones who had whispered the loudest now dabbing their eyes the hardest, and one by one they pressed her broad hands and called her Mrs., and this time, looking at the rancher who could not take his eyes off her, they meant it. And when it was done, when the vows were said and the ring was on her broad, strong finger, Wade Calloway did a thing that made the whole church go still and then go warm. He took from his coat the folded oilskin square. He had carried it himself since that day, would not let her keep it sewn away any longer, and he unfolded the deed in front of the witnessed congregation, and he took a pen from the clerk, and at the bottom, under August Brandt's spiteful, redeemed old signature, and under Verena Hartman's name, he added, in his own scarred, careful hand, his own. And then he handed her the pen, and she added back the name she now shared with his, so that the deed to the Calloway Ranch read, from that day, in 3 hands across 30 years, the man who built it and ruined it and gave it back, and the fat immigrant cook he trusted it to, and the broke, decent rancher who married her, owned together, the both of them, equal and earned, exactly as Wade had wanted, and August Brandt, wherever the wicked old redeemed soul had got to, would have grudgingly approved. The frost they had married ahead of came down hard that year, and the winter after, it was the worst the country had seen in a decade. The kind of winter that they had all said in the spring a fat woman could never last on the frontier. Del Sturgis had said it. The whole town had said it. Too fat to last a winter, they'd said, when she walked off the freighter. She lasted it. More than lasted it, she ran it. When the great blizzard came in February and shut the world down to a white roar, it was Verena who knew, from a hard Nebraska girlhood, to string the rope from the house to the barn before the snow came, so a body could find the stock and not freeze lost 10 feet from the door. Verena, who had laid in the stores all autumn against exactly this, the salted beef and the dried squash from her own long rows and the bins of flour, so that while other ranches in the valley lost cattle and went hungry, the Calloway place ate warm. Verena, who went out in the worst of it, on the strung rope, a great shape muffled to the eyes, and broke the ice on the water, and forked the hay and brought the weak calves into the warm kitchen to thaw by her own stove, big red hands rubbing life back into half-frozen newborn cattle on the floor of her own house. Wade came in from the storm one black afternoon and stamped the snow off and found his wife on her knees by the stove with a near-dead calf in her lap, breathing on its muzzle, and he stood dripping in the doorway and looked at her, the woman they'd all bet would die the first winter, kneeling warm and alive and unbeatable in the heart of the storm with a saved calf in her arms. And he crossed the kitchen and knelt down beside her in the puddle of melting snow and put his arm around her broad shoulders, and they thawed the calf together. "They said you'd never last a winter out here," Wade said, low, watching the calf's chest start to rise. "They were wrong about a great many things," Verena said. "Mostly me." "They were," Wade said. "I'll spend the rest of mine making it up to you that I was nearly one of them." And he kissed her temple, there on the kitchen floor in the middle of the killing winter she had beaten, and the calf between them shuddered and lived, and outside the storm screamed against a house that did not fall. The ranch did not die that winter. It did not die any winter after. The bull Verena bought with her last dollar threw big sound calves the next spring, and the drained pasture grew sweet grass, and the herd Pruitt had ridden up to seize at 600 head was 800 by the fall after, and 1,000 the year past that. Toby Pratt grew into a foreman worth 10 of Del Sturgis, and never once in all the years called the missus anything but the missus, with his hat in his hand. And Verena Hartman Calloway ran the kitchen and the garden and a good part of the ranch from a chair at the head of her own table on her own land, beside a man who had bet his whole life on her and won, and who told her, most nights, in the warm lamplight where it had all begun, the things she had crossed a country and given away a fortune and waited 9 months to hear a single decent soul finally say that she belonged there, that she had always belonged there, that he would have her and the ranch, and the both of it, exactly in that order, for as long as the both of them should live. And the oilskin deed, soft with 30 years of handling, hangs framed to this day, they say, on the wall of the Calloway ranch house. Not for the 40,000 acres it records, but for the truth it finally told, that a thing the world calls worthless can turn out to be the one paper that matters, and that the heaviest woman in the territory, on her knees, scrubbing a banker's boot print from her own floor, was all along the richest soul in the valley, in land, and in a man's whole heart, and in the kind of worth that no scale ever built by men was meant to measure. So if you stayed to the end, and you did, you good soul, you stayed, then you were there when the paper came out of the lining, just as I promised, and you saw the fat cook outrank every man who mocked her, and you saw her chosen openly in front of a whole town by the one man wise enough to want her more than the land she gave him. Leave your town in the comments if you haven't, so I can see how far Verena traveled and who she found. And come back to the warm side of the lamp again soon. There is always another road out here, and always, if you know how to look, somebody walking up it on foot to spare a tired mule, carrying sewn against her heart more than anybody bet she could.